Yo. Thanks again for checking out another edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm 12 Kyle. All right. So on this podcast, what I'm going to talk about is, quite frankly, this podcast. What I mean by that is, I don't know. I just said, you know what? I wanted to talk about the podcast and just, tell you what I thought about the podcast. I mean, it's mine, so I could tell you about it. Seriously, I was listening to the We Did That Shit podcast. Shout out to Babi and Maya. This is one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to weekly. Make sure that you check them out. And they always listen to this podcast and they show love and support. So I return the favor. And not to mention they have a dope podcast. So you can find them on any site where you get your free podcast. Nonetheless, I was listening to their podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I think someone had asked a question as to why they podcast, why they chose to podcast. And it got me to thinking, why do I have this podcast? And there's really no specific answer other than because that's what I want to do. But seriously, it's for me, this podcast is first of all, it's been a great outlet for me because it gives me a chance to, do what I want to do. As some of you know, maybe not all of you, but some of you may know, I had a internet radio show for 5 years, and it was called the 12 Radio Show. And don't get me wrong, I really loved doing the 12 Radio Show. I thought it was dope. I had a dope following. I had dope guests that went on to become friends and, people that I still kick it with to this day. And I was very appreciative of, how it was. But it got to a point when I was doing the show that it didn't feel or look or sound the way that I wanted it to. And it's kind of hard to explain, but it's like writing a story or painting a picture and then you're done with it and you're like, nah, that ain't it. But instead of erasing it or putting it away, it was out for public consumption. So for me, I was like, okay, you know what? Let me make this into a podcast. And I had no idea that this podcast would turn into what it has become. But just from a creative standpoint, it's something that I really enjoy. I enjoy creating. And it's going to sound kind of crazy, but I do this podcast for me. I don't, I don't do it for, accolades. I don't do it for, the women, the groupies. I'm married, so I'm good on that. But seriously, it's not. I do it for me. It's really just a cool outlet. And there's really, no reason why. I guess the best way that I can explain it is, and I remember when I was listening to their podcast, We Did That Shit podcast, and I wrote down this right here. This is what I wrote down as I was listening to it when I asked myself, why do I have the 12 Kyle podcast? And I said, I present it in a way, and it's coded in a way that people who are close to me can understand what I'm talking about and appreciate it. And those who aren't close to me can still rock out to it. And that in a nutshell is what this podcast is. And I'm definitely appreciative of any and everybody who's taken a moment to listen to it, because you don't have to. I mean, there's gazillion other podcasts out there. I will say, modestly speaking, once you listen to this podcast, you're going to listen again. And that's not, I mean, that sounds very arrogant, and I'm kind of arrogant and cocky, but that's just me. You got to know me to know that. But I'm being honest. There's very few people who listen to this podcast one time and say, oh yeah, I heard that one episode. I'm good. I don't need to hear anymore. It's probably not going to happen, right? Because I'm just talking about different things. When I think about, like, again, who's listening to this podcast, I'm going to be honest, and I think I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. I really don't have any clues listening to this podcast. I mean, I'm a cat who lives in Atlanta. I'm married, have kids, and I love stuff. I love sports. I love hip hop. I love, the stuff that I talk about. I'm a people person, but I don't have any, I have no idea who listens to this podcast. Outside of the people that hit me up on Twitter, and maybe outside of a few in my social network, as far as Facebook, Instagram, or what have you, I have no clue. Like, and so to give an example, like if you go on SoundCloud, right, there are these numbers that tell you, how many hits you've had as far as people who have listened. And I know that, they talked about putting it on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, if you will. And I think it's on Stitcher too, but I don't know. I know that I've looked at SoundCloud. So nonetheless, on average for SoundCloud, it's about, I would guess that it's a couple of hundred people a week. If you add in the other streaming platforms, I'd probably say it's probably about 1,000 people listen to this podcast each week, right? And for some, that's a good number. For others, that might not be a high number. I don't know when it, and I really don't care, because I've always said, like, the numbers, they don't matter. And I would be saying that if 20,000 people listen to this podcast. But to be honest, I really don't want 20,000 people listening to this podcast, because I don't want to have to change this podcast. I don't want it to be something that it's not. I want it to look and feel and be as authentic as it is. And I think if I had 20,000 people listening, it probably would change somewhat. But no, I don't, honestly, I don't know who listens. I can tell that quite a few people listen, but I don't know who listens. Like, I was looking at the SoundCloud numbers today, and I do myself that I will look at the numbers once a week just to see, how things go. And I learned from having the show on the 12 radio show that, certain topics are going to move the needle, some, more so than others. I mean, obviously, if I'm doing a podcast on relationships, certain number of people are going to tune in for that. If I'm doing a podcast on hip hop, certain number of people are going to tune in for that. If I'm doing a podcast on sports, certain number of people are going to tune in for that. So it just really just depends. But I'll be honest, I don't know 20 people in Sweden. But 20 people in Sweden listened to my podcast last week. I'm very, big in the UK, apparently, looking at these numbers. I don't know anybody in the UK. It looks like I'm a hit in Mexico. Quite a few people listening in Mexico and Australia, and the Netherlands. A shout out to the Netherlands. I don't know anybody in these places, so I don't know what it is or where it resonates. And please, if you're listening on SoundCloud and you're listening in another country and you happen to hear this podcast, please drop a comment. Hey, this is such and such from Uganda. What's up, 12Kyle? I'm serious. Send me a shout out in the comment section, because I have no clue. I'm just curious as to who these people are. You aren't bots. That's for sure, because SoundCloud does give you an indication that, who's listening and how long they've listened. So, people are sitting through these entire episodes. So it's not like, the Russians are fixing my numbers. But seriously, I'm curious, but I don't, other than the people that I interact with, I don't know who listens. And I'm totally cool with that. I really am. I just appreciate the fact that people listen. Cause again, I'm not necessarily doing it for you. It's for my benefit. And I'm glad that people, feel compelled or feel, cool enough to rock with it. I remember being in this Facebook group for podcasters that I was unceremoniously kicked out. But, that's another story for another day. I don't know how or why I got kicked out, but no shade. So anyway, I get kicked out of the group. But before I got kicked out of the group, I remember somebody asking a group question. That's why I got kicked out. I'm sorry. They said that you have to participate in the discussions, and I wasn't participating in the discussions. Not that I didn't care. I just didn't have time, but best of luck to them. Hey, it's no hard feelings on the real. Nonetheless, one of the questions one day was, how do you get friends and family to listen to your podcast? And do you feel upset if, they don't listen to your podcast? And I've read the question. I'm like, are you crazy? Like, I mean, I don't care. I mean, like, and I can only speak for me, right? But no, I'm willing to bet that there are more than a handful of you that faithfully listen to this podcast. And I have friends and family members that have never listened to this podcast. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I'm okay. I'm not gonna, like, my mom. I don't think my mom knows that this podcast exists, but, I don't think she's ever heard it. I'm pretty sure she heard the 12 radio show, but, she's never heard this podcast before. My dad he's heard this podcast before, and he used to, when I had the radio show, he would call in from time to time because it was a call-in show. So, but if my parents didn't listen to it, I'm not going to disown them. I mean, they're my parents. So that part of it is not really, at least for me, it doesn't matter. I mean, again, it's a podcast. First and foremost, everybody doesn't have time to listen to a podcast. I listen to a podcast because I have a lot of time at work where there's nobody that I have to talk to, and I'm sitting at a desk and, I'm uninterrupted. So it's just me. And so I'm not being bothered or talked to, so I can listen to podcasts all day. And I spend, quite a bit of time in traffic in Atlanta. So, I mean, hey, if you got an hour commute going both ways, you can get a couple podcasts in each day. So I listen to a fair share of podcasts. I don't listen to all of them. One being is that like some podcasts I just can't listen to, like, because they're not for me. And I'm okay with that. Like, and I'll give you an example. Like, if I'm listening to your podcast and, the podcast comes on and you just start talking and like it's multiple voices and you don't introduce the people and let them know who you are, I can't follow the conversation. So I don't know if it's 5 people in a room. I think you probably need to introduce, to the audience. But again, that's just me. I'm just kind of picky like that. But, to each his own. And then some people don't want to listen to a podcast with just one person on it. I love having guests, but no, most of these podcasts are going to be just me. But don't get it twisted. I love having guests on this podcast. And I'm going to get more guests as time permits. I definitely want to get my crew, Tactless Know-It-Alls, Ty and Mia. I've been on their podcast a couple of times. Great people. First, we're like cousins, really. Although they're Saints fans. I mean, but I won't hold that against them. And I definitely want to get Maya and Babi on here from We Did That Shit. I love their podcast. So I would love to have them on as well. And there's a couple other podcasts that I would like to, collaborate with as well. But, for the most part, it's one guy flying solo. And of course, now, if you've listened to this podcast, Eclectic is going to show up at some point. That's my dude. I mean, we go back to the radio show days. We are true diehard tenured hip hop fans. So we talk a lot of hip hop. We talk a lot of trash. We talk a lot of stuff. But that's my man, 30 Grand. So, he'll be back on here as well as my boys, D Love Hall and VA Easy. So there will be more than a few guests on here as well as Krishna and Shelly Shell. So, but for the most part, most of the podcasts, it's going to be me, because a lot of times when it comes to actually recording the podcast, it could just be me sitting in my library in my house at 11:30, and something just comes to my mind, and I'm like, okay, let me record this. So, I don't have a set schedule, to record. But, from time to time, I'll reach out to people like my homegirl Janae, or my man Matt, or anybody else who's been on the podcast, and bring them on and stuff like that. So it just depends. But, for the most part, I'm flying solo, and I'm cool with that. But, again, back to that question, I don't know how or why someone would be offended because their friends and family didn't listen to their podcast. But, I guess it depends on what you do it for. I don't do it for, I'm definitely not doing it for the money. I mean, don't get it twisted. I mean, because I have a job, right? So it's not like, the podcast is paying the bills. Now, if it was a situation where it could supplement my income, and let's say the podcast was bringing in 10 grand a month, okay, cool, let's do it. But, it's not. And I'm cool with that too. But no, I went to school for something else. So, it is what it is. But if it ever got to that point, cool. But it's not something that I strive for, because I just feel like anything else. I mean, if you're dope, you're dope. And that's all I want to do, is put out dope content. I always want to be in a position to put out dope content, because I think the creative side of me, the creator in me, if you will, when I stop recording, I want to be happy with the end result and be able to go back and listen to it. And I couldn't say that for all of the episodes of the 12 radio show, but I can definitely say that for every episode of the 12 Kyle podcast. So I feel good about what it is that I'm creating, and it's dope to me. So if the rest of the world thinks it's dope, hey, that's cool. But, I'm not going to catch feelings. And again, every podcast ain't for everybody. So, I mean, if I do a podcast on, I don't know, MF Doom, I know that a lot of hip hop heads are going to tune in. Are the ladies going to tune in necessarily? Probably not. That's just a fact. Will it be a hit in the Netherlands? I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? But no, I don't do it for that. I do it just because this is what I want to do, and this is what I want to talk about. So it'll never be a situation where I'm just talking just to be talking. And again, the numbers are cool to look at, but honestly, the numbers don't matter. They really don't. I don't do it for the numbers. I definitely appreciate all of the feedback that I get on social media. I love the feedback and people rocking with it. But I don't do it for the feedback either. People can feel free to leave comments. They can feel free to leave reviews. It's not something that I solicit. It's not because your opinion doesn't matter, because it does, good or bad. But, it's not something that I seek, if you will. Because again, I'm doing it for me. If I was doing it for, to make this the biggest and best, the largest, podcast in the world, then yeah, I would be telling you, hey, leave a review, give me 5 stars, give me this, give me that, but nah, I'm cool. I'm good. But any feedback is appreciated. I've never gotten any negative feedback. But I got a thick skin. I could take any type of criticism. And on this podcast, if you've been listening long enough, you know what I talk about. I talk about music. I talk about life. I talk about myself. Always love to go down memory lane. I'll talk about sports, relationships, dating, sex. I normally don't talk about religion. I don't think I've ever done a podcast on religion. I'm a very spiritual person. I believe in God. And I go to church, but I go every Sunday or every other Sunday. But nah, you won't have me on here quoting Bible verses. I mean, I just won't. And I don't talk politics. I think if you're anything like me, you're probably fatigued enough with the politics in this country. But every now and then I might have to, pull it back a little bit and talk a little politics. But generally, those are the two things that I stay away from. But other than that, I'm going to give it to you raw. I think at the end of the day, this podcast is something, again, that I do for me. I'm very appreciative for those who are along for the ride and rock with me. Ultimately, there are 4 people that I want to listen to this podcast. Should anything ever happen to me, I do know that at some point in time, hopefully 100 years from now, I won't be on this earth. And it's something that I heard my man Ty reference on the Tactless podcast. Hopefully these mediums will still be around. And I think this would be something dope for, my kids to listen to. Again, I don't know if SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts will be around 100 years from now, but I think it'll be something dope. I mean, because think about it like this. I don't know, any of you listening, if you had a relationship with your grandfathers, but like I have very little to no memory of my grandfathers. My maternal grandfather passed away when I was 1, and my paternal grandfather passed away when I was in college, but I didn't really know him. I mean, I'd only talked to him on the phone twice because he had a strained relationship with my father, excuse me. Nonetheless, it would have been dope to, pick up a record, pick up an 8-track and listen to their voice and get their opinions on how life was at that particular time that they were living. So, I've got 4 kids, and my wife and I, we always talk about how we will be as we grow older and how they will be when they grow older. And I think this would be dope for my kids to listen to. They currently don't listen now, but maybe some years from now they'll go back, take a look back and say, oh, my dad was making some pretty cool stuff, or my dad was talking too damn much. Knowing them, they'll probably say that dad was talking too much. But I've had my son Cameron on here. I'll bring him back on. I'll probably get Dion on the podcast as well. My son Brandon probably wouldn't get on the podcast. Skylar, she would, but Skylar would probably out-talk me on the podcast. So maybe if I keep this podcast going for a few years, I'll let her get on as well. But again, this is just something that I do that I really enjoy doing. And again, it's for me, and I really appreciate the fact that people rock out with it. And I guess for this podcast, it was so spontaneous for me to do. It's just something I just felt like talking about. I'm not even going to promote this podcast, this particular episode. I'm not going to tweet it. I'm not going to Facebook it. I'm not going to nothing. I'm just going to upload it. And when it's there for those people who need to listen to it, for those who subscribe and listen on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis or however you listen to this podcast, it'll be there for you to listen, because I genuinely believe that the people who are supposed to hear your podcast, they hear it. Just to give you an idea, like when I drop the podcast each week, every Thursday, right? So I'll drop it, tweet it out, Facebook it out, Instagram it out, and I'll tweet about it. Let me see. I'll probably tweet it 3 times on Thursday and then like once again on Saturday. And that's it. I don't believe in like just beating people over the head with the message. I mean, again, it's here. You can listen to it. Cool. If not, that's cool too. I'm not going to be mad if you don't listen. Why would I be mad because you didn't listen to my podcast? I mean, like, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, whenever I put this one out, I'm not even gonna promote it. I'm just gonna upload it and just let it be. And really, to be honest, that's how I feel when I release the podcast on Thursday. Once I'm done from the creative perspective, I'm cool. It's almost like writing a dope story, and then when you put that final period at the end of the story, you're good. And you know, the creative side of me really appreciates that. I'm a blogger too, so it's the same when I write a blog. Once I'm finished, once I type that last period and upload it, I'm good. And it feels good to you satisfy that urge to create. And to be honest, that's an urge that I've had since I've started this podcast. And that's what this podcast really has been, just my creation. And I've enjoyed it immensely. To be honest, I don't know how long I'll keep doing this podcast. For the foreseeable future, it'll at least be through 2018. But I enjoy it, and I it's not a job, it's not work for me. When it gets to that point, then that's the time when you have to step away. And if I'm honest with myself, I think toward the end of the 12 radio shows run, it became work for me, and I work enough. I don't need more work. So, yeah, so it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning. I present this podcast in a way, and it's coded to where the people who rock with it really understand it. And particularly those who are close to me. And if you're not close to me, maybe you might feel a little bit closer, or you might get to know me a little bit better just by listening to this podcast. And for that, I appreciate it. That's going to do it for me. Thank you for checking out another bonus edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'll catch you guys next time. 5 G's.